what I'm going to do is show you the assembly of this zoospore collection vessel. It looks a lot like this one. This happens to be the older version. This is the older version, the original version. If you have one, there's nothing really wrong with it. The only slight disadvantage we found is if you have a pair that's fairly good size and it's sitting here, sometimes it gets kind of lodged between the wall and the spout, and it has a tendency to get stuck there and you've got to dislodge it. So we made a couple of small changes to the design, make it a little bit simpler. First, we removed that coupling and shortened this whole arrangement. And we also simplified the pair exclusion device, the black band there. And we have to also change out that elbow with a different type with this new connection. So this is the newer type, and you see the newer pair exclusion device is just a zip tie, and there's more room in this area here, so your pair is less likely to get stuck there. Here's the parts from the original version, and the alteration is we're going to get rid of that coupling, and we're going to change out those two things. And we end up with a list of parts that look like this, with the exception that we're going to use only one of these two things, the O-ring or this flat washer. You don't need both. We're going to start with this Igloo 2-gallon sport cooler, insulated water cooler type of device. It has a spigot at the bottom down here, and we're going to pull that out first thing. So we're going to just unscrew the nut on the inside. You might need a wrench to loosen that up. And you can pull that and the O-ring out and the spigot out as well. So we've got now a hole here, but it's not big enough for the outflow that we're going to want. The outflow, to get enough flow right through here so we don't overflow the top, we want to use a 1-inch outflow. So we're going to need to make that hole bigger so we can fit a 1-inch PVC fitting. So what we're going to do is, there's a couple different ways we can make this hole, but I'm going to use a hole saw. This one is some kind of multi-size hole saw. But basically we're going to find a hole saw that roughly matches the diameter of that fitting there. So we're going to start out with this hole saw and bore that hole out. Now the tricky thing is that there's no center on this, so we're going to have to use something stable like this drill press here to make that hole. Alright, let's get this thing ripped. Alright, so now I've got a hole. Looks like it's about the right size. Check that hole size here by inserting this, and we can see it's actually going to thread in kind of. Okay, if we don't have a drill motor, or drill press, we can always use a drill motor like this. If we're going to use this arrangement, we're going to need to stabilize this thing. We've got a bungee cord holding it. And we're going to need to throw some blocks inside, wedge them in tight, so we can actually do a pilot hole with the drill bit. Alright, so we're going to give this a rip. Okay, we want to cut actually a small slit on each side of this non-threaded portion of the elbow. And why we want a slit instead of a round hole, because if we have a round hole, this whole thing will end up wobbling. But if we have a slit type of arrangement like in here, that's not going to be bouncing out of position. Alright, so you can use this a vise if you've got one. If you don't have a vise, I suggest you use a piece of scrap lumber or something like that, and then clamp it. Don't use your hands as a clamp. Okay, and then you want a small drill, or in this case I'm using a specialized bit known as a pin router. A pin router basically is designed to be able to route out sideways holes, but you can also do that with a standard drill. So the easiest way to do this is to make two small holes next to each other. Okay, so we got one hole, so we'll put a second one right next to it, just a little space between them. Alright, and then we're going to just sort of angle this and drag it and make a small slit. Alright, so we've now made a little slit there that's wide enough to put this thing in, but not wide enough to allow it to rotate completely. We'll do the same on the other side. Alright, so now we have two slits there. So what we're going to do here is place this in a way that we don't have a lot of sharp points sticking out, because we don't really want to jab holes in the pear. So the way we do that is this. We're going to leave this big coupling thing inside. We're going to loop this over the top and ring this back in through this hole. That way. It's better if your fingers are small. Then we're going to run that into the zip tie. Zip it up a bit. And then we can, this excess, you can cut it off, but probably just easier to tuck it down in the hole here somewhere. Or out of the way. So that'll work. And you'll see that this is not going to get pushed all the way out of the way. So that's that point. So now we're ready to assemble our container. Okay, so before we thread this in, we want to put a few wraps of Teflon tape on it so that we don't have leakage from these threads. So you just wrap it around a few times. That should be plenty. Snap it off. So we're going to assemble this container, this style. Starting with our container that we've removed the handle, the spout from, and we've bored out with a 1-inch hole saw. And this is another type of 1-inch hole saw that more likely you're going to find in the stores. Okay, so we have all the parts. We're going to assemble them now. So this is going to go on the inside, and there has to be the gasket to the inside that keeps the water from leaking out, and this is going to be threaded in from the outside wall. So the easiest way to start is if I get this into that hole a little bit. If your hole is just a little marginally small, you might have to thread it in. This is big enough that it kind of slips in and out without a problem. And that's not a problem. This is not what's going to hold the water in. It'll be the gasket that does that, or the O-ring. You can slip that in, slip the gasket or the O-ring onto that, and then we're going to thread the threaded end into there. We can start threading it by hand. At some point it's going to get too hard to screw and it'll still be too loose to really hold water. So that's where you need a tool of some sort to grab it. You can hold the inside with your hand, or you can find some other way to hold it. You're going to tighten that up pretty good and solid, because you really don't want that part to twist. If it twists a little bit when you're tilting the nozzle, that's alright, but generally that's what's keeping the water in the container, so that's got to be tight. That part is fine. Alright, now this can be either a thin wall or Schedule 40 PVC, but this is this little transitional piece. None of these joints are glued, but they're pushed in tight. So that's pushed in tight there. And we're going to take one of the elbows and push that in tight. So that piece just has to be long enough so that you can seat both of those very firmly in there. Next is the upright, and what's easier to do is to put the other angle on the upright first. Get it good and tight that way. And the last joint is to put that upright in there. We can use the leverage of the table to really jam it in there good and tight. So those are all friction joints, but because there's no pressure in this system, we're not going to end up having leakage. But we also want to still be able to do this, because this is what we use to control the water level when we're at the end of our baiting process. So looking down into this thing, we're going to use our little guide, and if we want to make a scribe mark on there, what the usefulness of scribing it with a scratcher like this is that the Sharpie mark can disappear after a while. It can fade when you clean this thing with bleach, or if you were to use alcohol, it would definitely rinse right off. But if you have a scratch on there, then you won't have to use this measurement thing again. All you have to do is just find those scratchy areas and re-ink them. Okay, so we got scratches on there, and then whether you use the scratches or not, if you don't have the scratches, you would just do this with the Sharpie. Just put that on there. And we want to have marks on, I would put it on all three of the ribs here. You want to have it on more than one side, because the issue is that often in the nursery you're not on a level surface, and the volume is not going to be right from those marks if we've got it tilted. So that's what we've got going there now. So we have a mark on each of those ribs there. So we'll quickly demonstrate why that's useful. Alright, we want to test this at the end to make sure that we don't have a leak from down this area. So you go ahead and fill it with water. There's enough water in this. Essentially, when the water reaches this level here, it should start to pour out this upper hole. And you can see there's a flow rate above which, if you go too high, it's going to start running over the top. So if that ever happens in the nursery itself, you can change the level slightly by tilting that, so that even if we're having a lot of water coming in, not that much, but we have more that same kind of flow. If we keep tilting this down a little bit, we can keep it from overflowing. But the bottom line is, typically our rates of inflow in the nursery are going to be something more like this, and so having it fully upright is going to give us more than enough capacity. That's why we use 1-inch pipe on this thing. Okay, the other thing we want to make sure is that we don't have any leaks coming from this area, so let me just turn this water off. And if we don't see any water dripping from here, then our gasket is tight and we're in good shape. So the last thing, and we already sort of alluded to this, is that when we want to eventually drain this down to those marks after the test is done, all we need to do is tilt this. We don't have to try to do anything fancy here. And as that thing is tilted, it'll drain to whatever level we have it tilted to. Typically we don't want to drain it super fast. The zoospores we don't want to create some kind of vortex that might draw zoospores down. So you keep a kind of a slow flow rate. And then you can just ease it down until you're at the mark. And right here now, you probably see it's at one of these marks. And you check all three of those marks to see it's even on that. And it is. So that's about 2.7 liters. And the bottom line is that when we can, that's what will fit inside a 1 gallon Ziploc bag. So then typically we have to make sure when you're in the nursery you don't handle this from the bottom or anything like that, because that's all contaminated. With your gloves on, you can just pick it up like so and then pour it into the bag. You can't have this sideways, because if you're tipping it, eventually you'll have water coming out this as well. So the easiest way then is just to tip it like so, and usually to keep your hands decontaminated, just do it with one hand like that. Anyway, that's the zoospore collection vessel, all done. This is a completed zoospore collection vessel in use in the nursery. You can see that the water is pouring in the top, it's pouring out through the spout and not overflowing the top. The pair is floating at the surface, and this is what we want to do to optimize the detection of Phytophthora by means of the pair bait.